to our panel today. We are really delighted to be hosting this panel and very grateful for our distinguished guests. Conspicuously absent fourth B of democracy. Thanks very much to Stacy Whittle and to Malcolm Butler for organizing this event. The panelists will examine democracy program within the context of the current administration's continued commitment to democracy and governance issues. President Obama's historic speech in Ghana last year renewed the American commitment to support democratic values and institutions around the world. With the USAID administrator fully in place, the panel will take an in-depth look at the administration's approach to supporting democracy programming, possible limits to it, and how support can evolve moving forward. We're going to be experimenting again today with a little bit different format, so we look forward to hearing your comments and how you like this approach. I'd like to now hand over to Malcolm Butler, who will be moderating this session today in the new way that we're talking about moderation. I think in your packets you have a background bio on Malcolm, and he, although moderator today, has an incredibly impressive background. He's currently at Management Systems International as a Senior Vice President. He's been the head of the Rican Foundation, the president of Partners of the Americas. He's had his own firm. He's been mission director for USAID in many countries and heads of many bureaus. He's worked at the National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, and at the State Department. But of course, most important to us is the fact that he has been a fantastic VP for programs on the SID board, and he is continuing on the board as secretary. So Malcolm, thank you for all your service, and let me pass the mic over to you.
But don't sit down, because I really don't want to let this occasion pass without thanking you personally, and on behalf of, I know Joe and Stacy, and all the members of SID, and all the people who are here who aren't yet members of SID, although I know you're all going to want to go out and join up. But that's it. It's been a terrific 3 years, and I personally have only had the privilege of working with you so closely in this last year, but it has been a privilege. And you've made an enormous contribution to this organization and to development thinking around Washington. So many thanks. For those of us, and I have to say us, for those of you who came here thinking that I was going to be a referee rather than a moderator because we have both NDI and IRI here, you're going to be disappointed. Because, in fact, I find that these folks know one another really well, and Sarah, and they walked in and started reading one another like old friends. And they've made these sort of presentations together on particularly NDI and IRI, Lauren and Ken, on a number of occasions. But I'm going to try and put some questions out there that are going to force them to draw some lines and see if we can't do that. And I hope you'll all do that too. But let me introduce these folks very, very briefly. And you do have their complete bios in the program. And I'm going to tell you how I think of them. In order here as I look down. Lauren I know because I've been around Washington for a while, and he has been mainly in the State Department and the National Security Council in the IRI for the last
21 years.
21 years. And he's worked in legislative affairs at the State Department. He's been the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Correct? Got that right? And before that, he was president of IRI, and after that, he was president of IRI. So he must be doing something right at IRI. So thank you for agreeing to be here, and we appreciate your participation. Sarah, I think of CSIS, and And I think of just about every prestigious university that we have where you either studied or taught. Yale, Stanford, Columbia, that's a start.
She couldn't get into Harvard.
And
She couldn't get into Harvard.
particularly focused on human rights in your career. And I think that that's something that will be very interesting as you look at the democracy portfolio at USAID, where you were Deputy Assistant Administrator. So thank you also for participating. And Ken, if I think of NDI, I think of Brian Atwood, my old boss, and I think of you. You've been there for a number of years.
4 years.
24 years. We have some real expertise here on our panel today, and I know this is going to be an interesting discussion. The format is that everybody's going to take 5 minutes to sort of make some comments about how they see the issues, and hopefully focus a little bit on the title of our topic here, the missing D. Everybody talks about the 3 Ds, but we don't hear too much about that other D, democracy. And so we want to talk a little bit about where it is, how it fits, and what democracy programming has been, where it is now, and where it's headed. So that's the format we're going to use. I'm going to ask all of you to be just as active as you can be. I will be recognizing people to answer questions. You've got microphones. Microphone. Please come to the microphone and identify yourself. And this format will be as successful as you are active. So we ask you to make sure that we keep things going. I will probably ask some questions myself. I think I'll be able to grab the microphone. So if I can ask each of you to make a little 5-minute presentation, and Lauren, do you mind if we just go around and face this way? Or
Why don't we start with Ken?
Ken.
And I'll go on.
all right, okay.
You go
I told you they've done this before.
Okay. Thank you, Mel.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate Joe and SID for hosting this and organizing this. Given the past controversies and the ongoing debate over where democracy fits into our overall policy, I thought it would be helpful here to push what has now become the proverbial reset button in order to clarify misunderstandings and misconceptions with regard to U.S. democracy promotion efforts. And U.S. efforts to support human rights and democracy worldwide have long been seen as serving American interests and reflecting our values. In recent years, however, a democracy debate has emerged among those who view democracy promotion either as too soft or idealistic as a response to threats facing our nation, or too bellicose, conflated with regime change and the use of military force in an unpopular war. Others even view democracy support as a combination of the two, Wilsonian idealism propagated through the barrel of a gun. Now, in the years since the United States became a superpower, we have viewed the world through an ever-changing series of foreign policy optics. Seen through the lens of the Cold War, U.S. policy was primarily focused on the containment of communism. During the 1970s and 80s, as the so-called third wave of democracy was in its infancy, the United States began another such change. In this sense, the new democratization optic was a reaffirmation of a process that can be traced forward from the Atlantic Charter, the Marshall Plan, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to the creation of the Helsinki process under President Ford, to President Carter's decision and determination that international human rights be a cornerstone of his foreign policy. President Reagan, in a 1983 speech at Westminster, broadened the emphasis from a concern for individual victims of governmental abuse to a commitment to foster and develop democracy. This led to the establishment by Congress of the National Endowment for Democracy and the 4 institutes affiliated with the endowment, of which IRI and NDI are 2. along with the Solidarity Center and the Center for International Private Enterprise. The Clinton administration identified the promotion of democracy as one of the principal pillars of its national security doctrine, and now with the Obama's national security strategy, he has done likewise. And under the leadership of then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who chairs NDI, and Polish Foreign Minister Bronislaw Geremek, the late foreign minister, a community of democracies comprised of more than 100 countries was convened in Warsaw in 1990. Now, a turning point, I think, in forging U.S. bipartisan consensus for democracy support came in the 1980s. And there were three, I think, seminal events: the snap presidential election in the Philippines, the presidential plebiscite in Chile, and the election in 1990 that brought Violeta Chamorro to power. And in all three, what you had prior to those events was a symbiotic relationship that existed between autocratic regimes and its radical opposition, sometimes violent opposition. And ultimately in this process, the Democratic center, from left to right, got squeezed out and marginalized. And it was only when this third way, this Democratic center, was able to provide an alternative, a viable alternative to these two extremes, ultimately did you have peace and stability. And these third way in these countries, in the Philippines, Chile, and in Nicaragua, enjoyed international solidarity and support, and Democrats and Republicans in this country came together to champion their cause. And it was a fundamental shift that brought both sides of the aisle together. Now, during this period, political reform and democratic governance also began to emerge in the traditional development aid community, as it became evident that traditional economic assistance and loan could not achieve sustained economic growth and social stability. Deforestation, environmental degradation, and agricultural policies that led to famine all traced to political systems in which the victims had no political voice, in which government institutions had no obligation to answer to the people, and in which special interests felt free to exploit resources, land, and people without fear of oversight or the need to account. Now, the need to support indigenous efforts that advance democracy was not to become solely an American enterprise. In its landmark 2002 Human Development Report, the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, asserted that unfiltered democratic participation is a critical end of human development, as well as a means of achieving it. The report further linked human development with democratic politics, which was a revolutionary document at the time. Regional intergovernmental organizations, the European Union, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OAS, the African Union sought to advance democratic standards. Non-democratic organizations in Africa, Asia, and Europe joined their American counterparts in supporting civil society, democratic political parties, women's empowerment, independent judiciaries and media, and free and fair elections. International groupings of political parties, ranging from social democratic to conservative, and interparliamentary organizations continued to foster these institutions of representative democracy. And even the World Bank, which has traditionally eschewed politics, began articulating a new development framework in which parliaments and civil society, along with governments, were identified as development partners. European aid agencies began defining their global anti-poverty mission as inexorably linked to democratization. According to Sweden's development cooperation policy, for example, poverty is not only about inadequate socioeconomic development and material security, it is also about the lack of political power at the individual level and the inability of citizens to influence decisions that affect their lives. So it is ironic that at a time when democracy and liberal principles governed, or sometimes governed, the discourse within and between nations, and when even autocrats who cling to power found it necessary to speak the democratic idiom, that democracy promotion became such a highly debated topic at home. It is unfortunate that the Bush administration, which had placed democracy promotion at the forefront of its foreign policy, created controversy over what had been such a bipartisan ambition. And until the 2003 Iraq War, President Bush's effective use of the bully pulpit, particularly in the Middle East, had provided an important measure of political space and protection for democratic reformers in an area where oil and diplomacy had dominated U.S. policy, and this was the one area of the world that was immune to the democratization optic. Now, despite growing indigenous demand for change after the Iraq War, international democracy assistance practitioners were now queried about whether the recipients of such assistance asked for help or whether external aid was an attempt to impose Western-style institutions. The imposition accusation became more common after the advent of the Iraq War. The debate over democracy promotion has taken place today also in the midst of a worldwide democratic recession. Freedom House reports in its most recent report that a global decline in political rights and civil liberties for the fourth consecutive year. And while global democratic trends over the past 3 decades are overwhelmingly positive, authoritarian states became more repressive in 2009, and declines in freedom occurred in a number of countries that had experienced progress in recent years. In addition to the deepening of authoritarian rule over the past several years, new democracies are struggling to meet voters' expectations, particularly in regard to improving the standards of living for all citizens and not just the privileged few. And this has raised citizen discontent over the performance and therefore the trust in the institutions of democracy. As Bronislaw Goremek has commented when he was foreign minister, democracy is by no means a process that goes from triumph to triumph, nor is it exempt from creating the very dynamic. Often, a new democratic regime inherits the legacies of its undemocratic predecessor: poverty, disease, and corruption. And this requires work on what the World Bank calls social accountability, engaging citizens and developing their skills to oversee government and to engage effectively in the political process, and also requires help in structural changes in political parties and parliaments that are necessary to make the levers of democracy accessible to all segments of society. Fortunately, there are other more positive worldwide developments. Major democracies such as Indonesia, Brazil, and South Africa have consolidated in recent years. Courageous democrats from Egypt, Zimbabwe, to Iran, Burma, and Cuba continue to struggle against tremendous odds to promote and protect their fundamental human and political rights. And a myriad of public opinion polls across borders and regions demonstrate widespread support for democracy, defying the thesis of a clash of civilizations. These survey findings, which tend to be consistent year over year, should put to rest the claim made by critics at home and by autocrats abroad that democracy is a Western or U.S. export. These results also are unsurprising for those of us who have worked with Democrats daily around the world over the last quarter century. A growing interdependent world and universal desire of individuals to have a voice in how they are governed have created a false dichotomy between American interests and American values. And a more meaningful debate, and hopefully we can continue this discussion, is about how to best support indigenous democratic movements and the nurturing of the democratic impulse that exists within all societies. It not only serves, I believe, American interests, but it is also the right thing to do. Thank you very much.
One, two, three, four.
Well, let me begin by thanking SID for Joe, Malcolm. Been a pleasure working with you all these years. Great to be working with you again this afternoon. As Malcolm noted, Ken and I often give talks across the U.S. with the World Affairs Councils in places Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon. And the first reaction we get when we walk in the room is, oh, this is going to be great. It's going to be like Crossfire, for those of you who are old enough to remember. The second reaction we get is exactly what Ken said: democracy building, Iraq, Afghanistan, forget it. I'm not interested in sending my son or daughter to, except if I'm not interested in sending my son or daughter for that kind of democracy building. And Ken and I usually have to spend about an hour and a half talking to people to get them to the point where they're saying, okay, if that's how it's done, that's all right. And I think that says something about where we are in this debate within this country. And I'll come back to that in a minute. One of the things we usually talk to people about is how long we've been doing this work. As Ken said, our organizations go back 25, now almost 30 years, originally in Latin America, later on in Central Europe, Africa, and the Middle East by the early 1990s. I always say that in the beginning, those of us who were the groups as part of this National Endowment for Democracy family, I think wanted to be the Walmarts of democracy building, that we wanted to do a little bit of everything. And I think we quickly realized that, let me use that one. I think we quickly realized that trying to do everything, we were doing nothing well. So we came to specialize really in what I call just a couple of issues. The first was political parties, working day in and day out with political parties. I'll come back to that in a second. Second was civil society, and more recently on governance. As I tell my staff, I thought we were always really good at helping good Democrats get elected. We were rotten at helping them once they get into power, and we're trying to change that. Both of us have worked in many, many countries around the world, as you all know. Often we'll put an office in the country so our folks can work day by day with those who are trying to bring about the changes. A common misperception about us at NDI is we pick the, quote, right-wing parties in a country and they pick the left wing. And we try and replicate the wonderful political atmosphere that we have here in Washington. Around the world, this is not the case. I'm currently working with the Belarusian Communist Party, and my board knows of that. I've worked with the Greens in Slovakia. We're really interested in working with any party that wants to bring democracy to their countries, so we will basically split up the work in a very complementary fashion. We'll do parties, they'll do civil society, or vice versa. We'll divide things up regionally. We'll do the west of Ukraine, they'll do the east of Ukraine. There are NDI countries. Nepal is an NDI country. Mongolia is an IRI country where we don't think it's big enough for the two of us. And really what we're working on is the nuts and bolts of political parties, not in a partisan manner, as I said before. So we will work, for example, with political parties on their platforms. But we will not come in and say, geez, you can't have that stuff about gun control, or you need to have a pro-life, whatever. We will just say, here's the issues that people in this country care about by polling and other methods. If you choose not to address them, that's up to you. If you choose to address them, you may have a chance of winning. And then we will go through, again, never prescribing solutions. And then working with them on the nuts and bolts of what political parties do, of trying to communicate a platform, that a political party can't just be a vehicle for an individual, for one person's ambition, that you have to address the issues that are of concern to the most people. How do you get volunteers? All these, like I said, nuts and bolts issues. On civil society, we're much more interested in the portion of a civil society or of a NGO's work that involves advocacy in a country. Many of you in this room, I know, are engaged with NGOs that do service delivery. And we think that is a good and wonderful thing, but again, not being the Walmarts of democracy building, we don't do that part. We're interested in the advocacy work that NGOs will engage in. I'm often asked, how do you choose a country? We really don't. They choose us. They come to us, people within the country, and say, we would like to have your help. And that brings about a couple of rules that I always tell my staff that they have to understand if they work at IRI. Obviously, with the salaries we give, you have to be kind of idealistic to do this work. But I always tell people, if all you're bringing is idealism, you will not do well here. That you have to have this balance of being very idealistic, but also very pragmatic. that the people in these countries we are working with may be the Thomas Jeffersons and George Washingtons of their countries, but they don't need more followers, at least not from us. If they have more followers in the country, they'd probably be elected. But they certainly don't need us to be their acolytes. They need us to give objective advice, but to give it from walking 2 or 3 steps behind and assisting and understanding it's our job to follow and not to lead, to give advice when we're asked. We always need to understand it's their country, not ours, and this is something I think a lot of Americans often forget, that a lot of these countries are not going to turn out looking like us. They're certainly not going to have our institutional arrangement in their country. Ours is very peculiar to us, but they're going to have to come about their own institutional arrangements to give people input into how the government is running in their own way. It may even be a while before the social and cultural issues that we think are important here, that they come to think those are important in their country. As I said, I always tell folks it's their fight, not ours, that we have to really be engaged at a distance on these issues. But certainly if we haven't learned anything in the last 8 or 9 years, it's that we cannot implant democracy in these countries, that if they don't want it worse than we do, we shouldn't be there. And because of that, we at IRI just in the last year have left a couple countries where I didn't think we were accomplishing anything, because it appeared to me that the people in the country, not the government, that's another issue, but the people in the country didn't want democracy at least as much as we wanted it for them. Final thing I tell my staff is you have to have a very un-American virtue to do this work. It's called patience. I often tell them that you will not be the person scoring a touchdown. It may be your successor's successor's successor. If they still have newspapers 15 years from now, you'll open the newspaper and read about the country where you did the work. But we Americans are great at saying, oh, we went to Haiti, we've been there for 3 years, we spent $100 million, how come they don't look like us? And we often have what I call country of the year syndrome, where a country's kind of in fashion for a year, but we get bored because they don't look like us after a year. And we decide to move on to a new country where we hope they will look like us. As Malcolm noted, I've been at IRI twice now. People often ask me what's the biggest difference the 2 times you've been there, and certainly it's a lot bigger staff, bigger budget. We're in places I never thought we would be in: Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, etc. Occasions the need for security. If you told me in the 90s we would need security, I would say we're just not going to work in that country. But those things come about. But the single biggest difference that we have, I think, is a little bit of what Ken referred to, that others are engaged in this work. When I first started doing this, it used to be the British political parties doing this work. The Stiftungs from Germany did it, and us. Now we work side by side with people from Sweden, with people from the Netherlands, with people from Spain. But often more interestingly, we work with people from new democracies. And both of our staffs are becoming multilateral. Really not American staffs anymore. 20% of my staff is from somewhere else. And frankly, I find the people who are from new democracies are some of my best program officers and regional directors, because they bring an empathy and an understanding that Americans simply can't bring to these countries, of what it's like to live in a dictatorship and what it's like to work to change a dictatorship. So we have people from, again, all over the world. We have, I think, 4 or 5 Serbians working for us in Iraq. I have a Serbian who now runs my Asia division. Folks from, like I said, all over. I recently had a trip. Sarah and Ken and I were together at the Community of Democracies. Ken just referred to that. And we got to watch the South Korean foreign minister. When asked, don't you think being an authoritarian country really helped your economy? He said, no, I don't think it did at all. He said, I think we did very well under an authoritarian government. But he said, I think our economy would have done a lot better if people had been free to make their own decisions about how to do these things and how to organize their government. I found out just recently that even India has been engaged in this work. They gave the Bhutanese a lot of assistance with their election commission and sent election observers. Even the Indians are quietly engaged in this work. So while we are kind of engaged after a very tough decade, and I'm old enough to remember a few tough decades ago, how things were and how America lost its confidence in the 70s, while we were engaged in kind of this navel gazing and saying, are we good enough to do this work? The irony is that others from other countries are doing it. I'll just finish out with a little story that I think illustrates how far this has gone. I was in Somaliland in June, right before the Community of Democracies conference, and I was telling the story before. We were sitting under a tree with the president of the University of Hargeisa. Most of you know Somaliland. This is the northern part of Somalia, not the pirate part, but the part just to the west of that, unrecognized by any country on this earth, gets very little assistance from the outside. Hargeisa was flattened during the Civil War. Pictures of it, there's not a building left standing. Now you have to look to find any evidence that there ever was a war in Hargeisa. We were there to observe an election which turned out probably the top third of elections I've ever seen in my life. The incumbent president, whose friends and family were saying, no, don't admit that you got defeated, say that there was something wrong with the registration or something like that. He said, I'm leaving. It's over. That's not how we do things here. So before the election, I'm sitting under a tree with the president of the University of Hargeisa, who's talking about his students. And he's talking about how he told them, your grandparents did something for their country, your parents did something for their country, your grandparents got sent out from the urban areas to the rural areas to teach people how to read. Your parents, your fathers had to go off to war. A lot of them didn't come home during the Civil War. The ones who did often were wounded. He said, I'm going to ask you to do one thing for your country for one day. I want you to go out and man the election tables for that day. These are the 18 to 22-year-old students from the University of Hargeisa, where, by the way, he told us we have the world's cheapest medical degree. If anybody here wants to be a doctor, it's $18,000 to get a medical degree at the University of Hargeisa. So I thought that's very nice. We'll probably see a few kids out there on election day. I think we had 78 tables all over the country on election day. There wasn't a single one where these students were not present on the election commission. In many cases, most cases, they were women. In many cases, they were actually running the election tables. They were the chair of the election tables. So back to sitting under the tree, I said to him, well, didn't your students say this is a Western thing, this democracy? It's a white man's thing, it's an American thing, and he just looked at me. And he said, no, only dictators say that. Later on in the trip, we were at the one person who did bring that issue up was a civil society activist. We had a panel for our election observers. And one person brought that up, saying, we have a lot of foreigners here telling us how to do things. We had a multinational delegation, about 1/3 US, 1/3 European, and 1/3 African. None of us responded. We didn't know what to say. The person who responded was the woman who is the chair of the election commission of Sierra Leone. And she said, yeah, people used to say that in my country too. But she said, you need to understand this is now a worldwide standard. And your country is only going to progress if you continue calling this democratic. So I think it's very important when we're thinking, is this something we ought to be doing? Are we being imperialistic by doing this? I think it's very important to understand in some ways we're being left behind if we don't do this kind of work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to SID, to Joe, Malcolm, and Susie for getting me here. I want to give you a sense. I joined the Obama administration May 10th. I want to give you a sense of what I've been observing, what we've been thinking about. My main job is to elevate democracy, human rights, and governance work at USAID and work with the interagency to develop strategies, ideas, and get them implemented. And I come to you after a 3-hour interagency meeting where we discussed a lot of this. So I want to give you a flavor of what's going on. I think while I like the provocative nature of the topic that's brought us here today, I think that you see a very strong commitment across the administration and a lot of great language in the national security strategy on democracy, human rights, and the promotion of democracy and human rights. There are a lot of papers in the works in the NSC that are going to be coming out that are essentially enabling tools for us. And the job at USAID is very much a critical one of turning the great rhetoric on democracy, human rights, and governance into reality. I've been spending an awful lot of time with colleagues at USAID to listen and hear about the work that is ongoing, and I see colleagues in the room, and to figure out how in the Obama administration we can translate what are specific priorities and initiatives and match them up with what's going on inside the agency. The president has several initiatives that I think are extremely promising for us, and that includes food security and global health. And I think everybody can agree we're not going to get food security or global health unless we have good democratic governance, unless we have human rights compliance. So we are at the beginning stages of working interagency and inside USAID to make that real. We've been thinking a lot about how you elevate the work of democracy, human rights, and governance at USAID. I think more than any time since the end of the Clinton administration, there's talk about this. We have a new bureau at USAID on programs, policy, and learning, and we're working very closely with them to think about what is the right, how we organize for success on this. If we take what it was a center, freestanding center, although I've learned that in AID speak there is actually no language for a freestanding center, but it was an entity, and then the Democracy and Governance Office came inside the bureau. And is it a good thing or a bad thing to have it in the bureau that it's currently configured? That's one of the questions that we're just beginning to discuss. Whatever the answer, I want you to be sure that what's going to end up happening is we're looking at the work that we do on a variety of issues, and that other people in the agency have a better understanding of how they cannot do their jobs unless they're well connected to what the core technical experts on democracy, human rights, and governance are doing. So it's to have a much better communication. It's to design programs from the beginning that are informed by democracy, human rights, and governance. There are, because we have limited budgets, and I will tell you that the FY10 budgets on democracy, human rights, and governance, state aids budgets are larger on these issues than they were in FY9. So far, we're building the FY10 budget, and I will say that I'm cautiously optimistic that we're getting what we want. But we have to prioritize, and so here are some of the themes and priorities that we're working on. We're going to be working with partners, including NDI and IRI, to help democracies deliver. I think one of the real concerns in the Obama administration is that we saw some amazing advances over the last 10 to 15 years. We have fragile and new democracies that don't always deliver on the promises. And so helping and working with colleagues to get these governments to be listening and responding to their publics is absolutely critical. And I think that we have a lot of tools in the toolbox to do this, certainly including the use of surveys and getting people to take seriously the need to listen and respond to their own populations. But I think there's also an interesting way that we can do peer-to-peer work. A year ago, I helped organize a civil society summit in Moscow to which the president came. And the idea was to have Americans who work on the U.S. come together with Russians who work on Russia. But it's a model, I think, that can be used in a lot of different places, particularly with new and fragile democracies. So you have Americans, peers, not necessarily, although it could be the NDIs and the IRIs of the world, people who are primarily working on the U.S. and taking advantage of all that expertise and bringing them together with folks in other countries. But it's also about taking a neighborhood approach and having a new and fragile democracy in a specific neighborhood, working with countries in that neighborhood and empowering those democratic activists to do that. We're very concerned about the closing space around civil society and what that means. The Secretary's speech in Krakow, something that a lot of us worked on for a long time, I think was an important marker. We're spending a lot of time thinking about how we translate the finding or the statements into reality, and aid and state are going to play a critical role in that. We're particularly concerned about how we as democracies and government organize better to protect civil society. I personally think that the way to do this has to involve listening and responding to civil society. It's not enough for governments to come in and say, here's the answer, that it's going to be country-specific, and activists in different regions of the world, whether it's Russia or Egypt or Venezuela, are going to have very specific needs and requests, and we need to be organized to be able to listen to them. We've been talking a lot with my colleagues about accountability and justice, and I think that as a development issue, how societies around the world reconcile or not with their past is absolutely critical to their political trajectory. And so I think we're going to be working and thinking about how to elevate this as a development issue and embolden the activists who, in places like Russia, and I'm thinking of the organization Memorial, have worked so long on this. And occasionally you actually find leaders of countries who recognize this. Strikingly, President Medvedev on October 30th last year did this video blog where he talked about the importance of remembering the victims of Stalin. And why this is important is if you think you want to have a country that's democratic and rule-based, rule of law-based, it's very hard to do that if people have memories of a dictator that is more favorable than negative. So it becomes an actually critical component to developing a citizenry that is interested in human rights. I think certainly at AID and across the interagency, we're talking about how do you harness innovation and technology in support of democracy, human rights, and governance? What are the tools that are out there? It's tough for government to be innovative, and there's a lot of innovative tools out there. But for example, are there ways in which we can be using technology in a preventive way so that we understand and can prevent violence before it's happening? One of the things that we're just beginning to think about is in humanitarian and disaster relief, we have DART teams that go out and plan. Why don't we have something like that in a political situation? Essentially, a political pre-election DART team so that if contested elections turn violent, what does that mean? How do we plan for that? We're absolutely committed to strengthening the capacity of human rights and democratic activists around the world, and I think that very much involves helping them listen and respond to local constituencies and making sure that they are embedded in with their citizenry rather than looking to donors and outside organizations that fund them. That ultimately gets back to this issue of how do new and fragile democracies develop. Part of that is about the government, but a lot of that is about civil society. I think we're also beginning to think about how we organize against prevention of genocide. This is something we're very concerned about. We're talking a lot at USAID about governance and what good democratic governance means. And I'm having conversations with other donor agencies, with foundations, and I think a lot of us feel that a lot of money has been spent on governance, and we, together with partners, need to be thinking about how do we think we're getting where we want to go? Are there other strategies for getting there? I want to close by saying that everybody ought to be clear that the White House is deeply, deeply invested in all the kinds of things that I've laid out. In the National Security Strategy, if you haven't read it, there's an entire section on democracy and human rights. And President Obama has made clear that promoting democracy, human rights abroad are priorities. I'm quoting page 37. The United States must support democracy, human rights, and development together. So unless there's any confusion, I think the Obama administration is deeply committed to essentially making rights a reality and strengthening democratic governments and societies around the world. And of course, we can't do that without the help of our partners. So we look forward to hard questions and conversations. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all three of our panelists. Those were really very interesting comments. And Sarah, it's good to see that forward-looking set of new ideas that the agenda that the administration is going to be working with. However, let me just ask the first question and urge all of you to be formulating your questions and to come up to the mic. But let me ask the first one. despite the language which you just read, and the fact that democracy and governance is one of the key elements of the strategy of the PSD draft document that's been leaked around town, there is a perception among our community, and I think among many of us in this room, that democracy and governance has not been a key element of the strategy, the development strategy, or the foreign policy of this administration. And I'm asking you because
I'm the one sitting
you're
here.
a member of the administration, but I also think this is a good question to get the perceptions of both Lauren and Ken.
So let me, as I understand it, rephrase the question. So you're asking, do I think whether or not democracy is...
Actually, I would phrase it a little differently. I would say, without regard to whether it's true, why is there perception that it's not getting the same emphasis?
I think that we are organizing ourselves to better articulate what we've done. I think that the reality is, in terms of budgets, we're spending more. I think that, looking around the room, I had about 16 or 17 colleagues, all of whom are very strong human rights and democracy advocates, and I think part of it is coordinating. And I mean, as somebody who's 2+ months in, there's several of us who've come on relatively recently. So part of it is, turns out it takes a long time to get people into the government, and then once you're in the government, it takes a while to figure out how the levers of power work and who's sitting where and where the alliances are. So I think it's in part a bit of a tempo thing that in a lot of administrations, people tell me that there's a cycle of, sort of the first 2 years, and you're figuring out what you want to do, and then there's a lot of execution. So I think that we're into a period where, certainly I've been thinking a lot about what are the priorities, and we're moving very rapidly into an execution phase of those priorities, and I think that that's true in the interagency. I also think that on some level, without being terribly partisan, that there is, at the end of the day, you're never going to please everybody. That we could be doing the most amazing work on fill in the blank, whether it's torture, freedom of assembly, combating trafficking. And there's going to be bloggers or internet or certain news channels that are going to be hitting us. And I think the real thing to keep in mind is, and the real constituency is, are we making a difference in the lives of people on the ground? So that's why I think this work around the Krakow speech is actually quite important for not only the United States, but other democracies, senior government officials to be coming together and listening to civil society about how we can best support them. And if we begin to have a strategy that, unfortunately the United States can't change everything. But if in certain countries where they're beleaguered democratic and human rights activists, if we can have a set of strategies, that's going to really make a difference.
Maybe I can also insert in it in a different way. Probably if we were having this discussion a year and a half into the Bush administration, we wouldn't be talking about a freedom agenda. That this is an evolutionary process. And I think because to some degree because of the controversy, I mentioned as be nice to America, or we'll bring democracy to your country, captured a problem. And when you can reduce a problem to a bumper sticker, you know you've got a problem. And I think to some degree, there was a problem with this issue. The language, even the soaring rhetoric of President Bush, who did, I think, some wonderful things in this area. When you analyze certain places, it was a rather traditional approach. He pushed democracy in a number of areas, but when it came to Pakistan and President Musharraf, he was our indispensable ally. When it came to President Obiang of Equatorial Guinea, he was our good friend. Cameroon, when we needed his vote on the Security Council for Iraq, he was our good friend and feted at the State Department. So in a sense, there, aside from the rhetoric, and aside from some of the accomplishments in the Middle East in those early years, the policy was a continuation, I think, of the previous administration. And I think for this administration, there was a worry at the beginning that democracy would fall off the foreign policy shelf completely. And I think the speeches in Oslo and Prague and Ghana and Egypt and Moscow and New York and UNGA, all those speeches and the Secretary's speech in Georgetown and Krakow, all those were designed that rhetorically that the administration now was comfortable talking about these issues in very traditional ways to try to reassure people, both at home and abroad. Secondly, the budget requests, in many cases, were higher when they came into office. The Millennium Challenge Corporation was almost doubled. The Middle East Partnership Initiative was doubled. The National Endowment for Democracy request was increased. So from a budget standpoint, from a rhetorical standpoint, there has been a process and a real movement. Now, there has to be operational things on the ground too, but I imagine this administration, like every previous administration, will balance these issues. I think I'll just conclude by saying the big change over the last 25 years is that every single U.S. ambassador in every country has democracy today as part of his or her portfolio. That didn't exist 25 years ago. Now, we can argue where democracy is in that portfolio, and that's the struggle that we deal with all the time. And I think that'll be the challenge for the administration is when it gets to the operational level on the ground, how you deal with this issue from that perspective.
I have a little different view, as you can probably imagine. I think, first of all, the idea that these are partisan critiques. I'm very happy to welcome the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, the New Republic into the Republican fold, if that is the case. These are not partisan criticisms. And I will tell you up front, as somebody who did democracy and human rights in the first term of the Bush administration, it's never an easy job. But I will also say that I had it easier than most in that I had a president and a secretary of state who really were big on this issue. And I would be the third person in the room talking to a foreign government about these issues, not the first. And it's very, very difficult when you're the first person in the room talking about these issues. You know, as far as time frames, you can compare things. By January of 2002, a couple months after 9/11, we had our marching orders on democracy. In fact, in the summer of 2001, before 9/11, I said I want to really push democracy building in the Middle East, and I was told by Powell that's a really good thing. Go down and do it. And I sat down with Ryan Crocker and Bill Burns, and we figured out how to begin pushing it before 9/11. So you can, I'm not sure who you want to make the comparison with, but I think an analogous comparison is with another president who came to office after a very, very unpopular president had left. A very, very unpopular president had made a number of foreign policy mistakes, including in the Middle East. His mistakes were blamed in large part, on his concern with human rights and democracy. And the president who came into power, a lot of people in his party said, we're going to get rid of that Jimmy Carter softy democracy stuff. We're not interested in that. And if you look at the first year of the Reagan administration, it's not dissimilar to what's been going on. That Ernest Lefevre, who was the nominee for Mike Posner's job, the job I had, got turned down by a Republican Senate. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee turned down Reagan's nominee to do human rights in September of 2001 by something like a 17-8 vote. Republican Senate. That's how bad it got. Now, 17 months into his administration, Reagan lays out at the Houses of Parliament in Westminster. Not only gives a great speech, speeches are easy to give, he lays out a strategy. He says, he's put to bed, or he's put out all the doomsayers in his administration who said this is a bad thing. He gives a speech. He says not only florid words, but he said, here's a strategy, which now sounds obvious, but at the time was pretty new.
we're going to actively help people in these countries who are fighting for their democracy. That was pretty new at the time. And he said, just to make sure my speech gets followed up on, we're going to have an organization that's going to make this happen. It was the National Endowment for Democracy. Within a year, it was actually operating. I think that is a fair comparison. Now, I get that a lot of people didn't like George Bush. I understand that I was in that administration. But I think to keep using it as an excuse after 30 years of a bipartisan policy that really began with Jimmy Carter and was taken into a different dimension by Ronald Reagan is a little tough. I think the speeches have been great. You know, I read the Nobel Peace Prize speech. I was there for Secretary Clinton's speech. I think the speeches have been wonderful. I think the difficulty that people are having 17 months after President Obama came into office, the same amount of time it took Reagan to get this going. The difficulty the administration is having is not only making the speeches into policy, it's convincing the bureaucracy, no, we actually do care about these issues. And what you're seeing now, yes, you may see budget increases, but what you're seeing now is in places like Belarus and Syria and Iran and Cuba and popular perceptions in Egypt, you're seeing what looks like a pullback by the administration. Now, maybe the people at the top are saying, that's not what we want, but that's what the people at the bottom are doing. And the administration, if they really believe it, they need to turn the great speeches into reality and have the people at the bottom understand this is really, really what we want. You know, leave aside the comparisons with Reagan and where everybody was at 17 months. If you give this administration a lost year because of an anti-Bush antipathy, it would be fair to ask 28 months or 30 months into the administration next summer. I think it would be very fair then to ask, where's the beef? But give them a lost year, and in a year ask, where's the beef?
Can I skip it?
You want to comment back?
So
Sure.
essentially you're saying, invite me back in 12 months and then say, okay, where are we? I will say that this administration came in with just unbelievable challenges that I think are really unprecedented in U.S. history, whether you're looking at the economy or the wars. So that has to be part of the equation.
You know, I wondered that very question. Did President Obama have more to deal with than President Reagan did? And I went back and I looked at the unemployment rate. It was 10% at this point in Reagan's administration. Inflation was extremely high. There was a huge economic crisis. This may be the biggest one since the Depression. That one was pretty big. The Cold War was on. All administrations have a lot to deal with. That's supposedly why people run for president, because they want to do something about it. But to say we've been too busy to deal with this issue is a little difficult.
Let me urge everyone to look at the study that just came out saying that if there hadn't been the bailout, you'd be looking at something like, I think it was a 15 or 16 or 18% unemployment.
Which is why I'm saying a lost year. Let's meet again next summer and see what's going on.
Should we open it up to the public?
Great. Well, I encourage you to talk back and forth to one another. That's what the format's about. And thank you for your patience. Could you identify yourself, please, and then and ask your question? I'm not.
Citizenship or citizenry, recognition of its government, I think, is a key element of democracy. USAID's agriculture strategy has one of its goals as promoting confidence of the Afghan people in its government. How do you see this can be accomplished?
Do you have a preference, or should we just?
First, the Sarah from USAID. Talk right into the microphone.
I'm sorry.
Again?
Could you try one more time and get right up on top of the microphone?
A citizen's recognition of its government is a key element.
I'm in trouble with the freedom of expression here.
A citizen's recognition of its government is a key element of democracy. USAID has as one of its goals in its strategy for Afghanistan as promoting confidence of the Afghan people in its government. How do you see this being achieved?
Maybe we could check out the microphone. No.
One of the advantages of having come in on May 10th and it being July 30th, is that I can say I've not looked closely at the agricultural policy in Afghanistan. But on the face of it, I think this issue of, I think it really gets to this issue of governance. And on some level, we use the word governance, but what we really mean is good government, effective government. And I think that the issue of, in any kind of food security and trying to build confidence of citizenry in their government, it is actually making sure that the government delivers and having accountability mechanisms, organizing and supporting citizens to do monitoring so that there are report cards. I mean, there's all sorts of tools that are used all over the world, and encouraging and supporting partners that can help do that. I mean, I think there's a huge role for independent media in this. Oftentimes people ask, well, where does anti-corruption fit? And you can't combat corruption if you don't have an independent, strong, robust media. You can't do it if you don't have an independent, robust judiciary. So I think these are all of one piece. So without having looked in detail at what we're doing in terms of agriculture in Afghanistan, I can think of a lot of strategies that we certainly ought to be doing.
I would say that the governments also have to deserve the confidence of the people. And they have to act in a way that citizens believe that the government is behaving in a way that represents them, and that authority derives from the people, that the authority of the government derives from the people. And I'll start with the elections last year. Both Lauren and I were in Kabul last August. You have an election which was stolen. Karzai may have won the election, but he probably stole an election he would have won anyways, where you had 1 million votes that were fraudulent. And if a government is willing to commit grand theft auto when it comes to an election process which is so visible, petty larceny in terms of stealing money is no big thing. And so therefore it's hard to have an anti-corruption campaign in Afghanistan on the heels of a corrupt election. And unfortunately, the international community refused to take a tough stand on that election process. And they said, well, let's look beyond the election, let's look now to the parliamentary election. And there's very little prospect that the parliamentary election, hopefully I'll be wrong, the parliamentary election is going to be much better than the presidential poll. So I think to some degree that the international community that's paying so much in lives and in money have to be insistent that the government behaves in a certain way that gains the trust of the citizens. And it can't just be a PR operation. There has to be real, measurable things that the government does. And I think this requires a devolution of power to provincial and local governments. For the people of Afghanistan, Kabul is a spectator sport. And it's the city of sin so far away, which is true in most countries. But if that government refuses to devolve power to locally elected subnational governments that actually deal with people, you're going to find a continued gap between the people and their government. And so devolution of power becomes, I think, an important ingredient to this.
I find if you look at how we handled these two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, I think it's certainly evident that in the first couple of years we were in Iraq, we'd forgotten all lessons of counterinsurgency. I think the soldiers have had to relearn them, thanks to Petraeus and others. But one of the things I think they've relearned is you have to have, at the very least, accountable democratic governance, at the very least at the local level. Otherwise, people simply don't trust the people, the governors, government that they're closest to. I don't think we've yet, I don't think this was true in our administration either, I don't think we've yet understood that it has to be the case also at the national level. And it's not just in countries where we've got a war going on. If you looked at what we did in Azerbaijan for example. We had a couple of crummy elections in Azerbaijan. We gave them a pass. The Bush administration on that. We've got to look at elections not as an issue, an event to be gotten past so we can really get to work, but incorporating that kind of event into the strategy we have for the country. It's great to do it at the local level. We haven't figured out how to ramp it up to the national level in the way we're thinking about it, and I think you saw that in Afghanistan.
Dan? And I know you'll put a question out here that's going to
Yes.
get people
Okay,
to
so
focus.
I think this works, but I have a really loud voice. My wife's always calling me that, so I think it'll be okay. I'm
Did
Dan
your
Rundy.
kids tell you that yet?
Yes. I'm Dan Rundy. I'm a SID-Washington board member. In a past life, I was in the Bush administration with Andrew Natsios, and I'm currently at the World Bank. And it's a really great panel. And thanks, Sid, for organizing this important topic. I speak to a lot of folks in the Arab world about, whenever I meet someone from the Arab world, I'll say, are you optimistic about democracy in Egypt? Are you optimistic about democracy in Jordan? And putting aside, let's put aside Iraq for a moment. Let's put and perhaps Afghanistan just because of their thorniness. But let's say that any of the other Arab League countries, without, I know we could write books about this topic, but I'd be interested in sort of the NDI and RI positions on, are you optimistic about democracy in the Arab world over, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
Actually, I want to say something. In my previous life, I did a lot of survey work. And before you do a survey, you do focus groups. We did a lot of focus groups over the years on how Russians think about democracy and human rights. And it became pretty clear to me that if you unpack certain terms, it means something to people. But on occasion, I came away feeling like the democracy, for a lot of people in a lot of places, doesn't translate very well. But if you ask them, do you want to have the ability to choose your own religion? Or do you want to be able to choose who is governing, essentially? Or choose to what you're listening to on the radio? That has much more specific and concrete meaning for people.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I'm optimistic only because going to what Sarah said in terms of surveys. If you look at Pew surveys, if you look at the World Opinion surveys, if you look at the World Value surveys, the Arab Barometer surveys, and others, they all say the same thing, that in every single Arab country, it ranges from usually 78% to 88% that they ultimately want democracy. They believe government has to result from the authority of the sovereignty, results from the authority of the people. Government derives its authority from the people. They believe in a free press. They believe in independent judiciaries. They believe in multi-party elections. They believe in all the forms and the norms of democracy. Where there is a difference is when it comes to sort of liberal values. And this country has debates over liberal values too, after more than 200 years. So sometimes when it comes to women's rights, those surveys change. When it comes to issues where some would say it's promiscuity, whether it's gay rights and other issues, on the social values issues, you have different results. But when it comes to fundamental issues of democratic institutions and processes, there is a broad consensus. Secondly, I think the debate has been now open in the Middle East. And now there are people in every country in the region. Some of them are in government, some of them are in parliaments, some of them are in political parties, some of them are in civil society. There are a critical mass of people in these countries that also see themselves as a third way between religious extremism and authoritarian governments, and view themselves that way. And again, what happened in Chile and the Philippines and Nicaragua is also playing itself out in the Middle East. I don't believe in Egypt you have the Egyptian citizenry falling into two camps. One, the NDP, the ruling party, and in the Muslim Brotherhood. But the system, that's the only choice that people have, the only choice people are given. So yes, I'm optimistic because I believe that what the people want And ultimately, I believe that there is a nascent movement in these countries that have gotten stronger over the last 10 years. And partly, I think the Bush administration deserves credit, particularly in those years before the Iraq War, for providing space and protection that allowed these groups and these individuals to emerge.
I'm optimistic, maybe not 5 to 10, but 10 to 20 years from now. I think as more and more of these societies open up, and you can see a back and forth and a 2 steps forward, 1 step back in a lot of these countries like Jordan or Morocco. But if you look, and honestly, this started in the 90s. If you look at where Oman was, if you look at what Qatar was doing in the 90s, if you look at what Morocco was doing in the 90s, what Jordan was doing in the 90s, often, usually monarchies, the younger monarchs, with the exception of Oman, came into power and said, my dad did a lot of great things for this country, but they had been educated abroad and they saw good things overseas coming from more pluralism. And so that started that. I think we gave it a boost, especially in the first term. I think we did a lot more work in the first term and a lot less talking. I think it was kind of the reverse in the second term on these issues. But I do think it's important that the U.S. be there on these issues, and including on the symbolic issues. Sometimes we don't think those are important, but in a lot of these countries, a lot of these regions, the one case, the symbolism means a lot, and it's going to be important for this administration to be there on those issues.
Is this working?
Yeah, now it's working.
Okay, good. Hi. I'm Bob Burke, World Federation of the United Nations Association, former International Vice President SID. I may not leave the room alive after this question, but let me try it. I am struck by the fact that you have talked about 2 big trends, a recession in democracy and more actors working on democracy. In the development field, we hear the same thing. There are more actors in development, and we got some big problems in development. And a lot of people simplistically say, okay, thin down the number of actors.
U.S. and foreign, or just U.S.? More
International.
International.
600 agencies show up on a tsunami and so forth. I'm just wondering how you sort out these 2 trends and rationalize them.
Should we take a couple questions?
Yeah, why don't we do that?
You
Why don't we
want to
take a couple questions and then we'll go through? Yeah, we're running out of time.
Hello, my name is Tatiana Solda. I'm from Belarus, and I'm American Organization Resource and Policy Exchange. I have 2 questions to NDI and IRI about a strategy for democracy building, differences and similarities for Belarus. Thank you.
Let's have one more.
I'm Ragat Al-Sadi, and I want to ask a question as Iraqi person. Would the U.S. government or the USAID consider democracy and human rights programs in Iraq as priorities after the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq, especially if we look at this goal as double-sided? In one hand, that will make the U.S. government have approached their goal in democracy establishment in Iraq, as well as will help Iraqis to have normal life. Thank you.
Why don't we get each of our panelists to address any parts of those 3 questions that they might choose to.
Just going in reverse order on Iraq, I would say, certainly looking at the budgets, yes, this is a continued priority, but I'd also be really interested in what you think USAID ought to be doing, what the priorities are. We can talk about it afterwards. What are the most important things that this donor agency and others could be doing to support democratic and human rights activists? I'll just say that as an observer of work that's been done by lots of organizations in Belarus, I've been just amazed at some of the social media and journalists that in a place where you've lost dictatorship in Europe, that there are amazing voices to be heard and supported. And incredibly creative, using humor. When I was at the Community of Democracies, I chaired a panel with a series of activists, and we had a wonderful Belarusian, Irina Vidanova, on the panel. And the work that she's done in her organization are amazing. On aid working, clearly more is not necessarily better, but less can really hurt.
You're trying to get in.
What are we doing? Maybe the window.
I think that's
Window cleaners.
I think the real issue, we're having a lot of conversations with the administrator at USAID about making sure that the dollars that we're spending are effective in being able to monitor and evaluate what we're doing. And I think there's very exciting work that was done at AID, particularly in the Democracy and Governance Office, thinking about treatment design and benchmark surveys and follow-on. And I think there are a lot of models to build on that can show even especially in the democracy and human rights world that there's an effect, that we're having an impact.
Let me just comment here. You mentioned a benchmark, and that sort of turns me on a little bit here. We're talking a lot about national level measurements. If I were really trying to get to the bottom of democratic progress, I might be looking more at school boards and city councils and bloggers. You mentioned, can you say what's on your mind on the internet without fear of retribution? But these things are really hard to get down to. They're really hard to measure. They're much more difficult than did they have an election A or did they not have an election F? So
I think a lot of this is actually in program design. I think that if you're trying to, for example, you've got a campaign that you've got on the internet or in social media, and you can use surveys to show whether or not you're reaching the audience. I think also making sure that you're driving people to the sites or things that you can measure. So I'm actually relatively optimistic, but I agree with you that having the picture at 65,000 feet doesn't necessarily capture what is most important in people's lives. And that, again, I come back to the use of surveys. I think that, for anybody working with local activists, having as much information about what the local population thinks is important is really critical. It's not actually what we think, it's really what they think and what they need. And making sure that we're set up to work with local partners to make that happen and deliver on that.
we had 3 questions on the table that we can.
Just on that one, I would very much agree with Sarah here. I think we who work at the national level with political parties and civil society and national elections have been working more and more at the local level on governance, which I think a lot of money, as Sarah said, has been spent on. I think there's a lot of effort to, quote, provide services. What I find where we're doing work is that often the services provided aren't what people wanted. They're very grateful to have them, but it's kind of like, did nobody know we had a school 6 blocks from here? We didn't need another school, we needed the well dug kind of thing. And that's where we've gotten really engaged, is in what I call the democratic aspect of governance, is exactly what it is you want here. We did a program, very first program we ever did in Soacha, Colombia, which is the poorest portion of Bogota. And we found, much to our surprise, that people actually, this in Colombia, actually wanted more security in the slum. They thought there was too much crime. And we worked with the national government, and they were able to turn up 200 more foot policemen to work in the neighborhood. There were a variety of other issues, schools and water and stuff. But we had this ceremony. We tried to stay in the background. They kept pushing us up to the front, and afterwards this teacher came up to me, and she was about 70 years old. And she said, I've been teaching my kids for 45 years that this is how democracy is supposed to work, and now in Soacha, what we want, we're finally going to get. And there you have an instance where democracy actually worked for people, instead of, I get to cast a ballot every 4 years, isn't this wonderful, and nothing changes in between. If it actually changes at the local level, I think people really appreciate that. I think Iraq will continue to be a priority, maybe not at the same levels. It's hard to keep up the same level over time. On the many organizations, but still a deficit, I must say, having just been to Somaliland, where there's almost no foreign aid, you have to ask that question. But I do think, as tough as it is to coordinate inside a government, and anybody who's been inside in any administration can tell you how hard that is. I used to joke that if we could actually reach agreement within the administration, we could talk to the foreigners. As tough as it is to reach agreement within the administration, the international coordination of this work is going to be really, really important in figuring out complementarity. You know, just as Ken and I talk about, you know, should we do this country, should you do that, should we do the East, should you do the West, it's going to be really important for the U.S. to do that. I think we're doing it more and more at an NGO level, but it's going to be important, at least in this sector, for the U.S. government to be engaged in that.
Just a couple points. One, and I agree with Sarah too, the huge issue is how do you link citizens with their government, with their elected officials. In most of these countries, politics is very, very vertical. And how do you make it much more horizontal so people listen to people? And focus groups and surveys are very important. Both organizations do that. We, NDI, have a focus group center in Morocco called People's Mirror, in which parties and government and the press used it constantly to get feedback. But at the same time, focus groups and surveys can't replace direct contact. You don't want to constantly short-circuit the notion that you have to actually meet with people and talk to people and interact with people as well. So it can be an important tool, but it can't replace the direct interaction, because mostly people say, listen, I hear them during the campaign period, and then I never see them or hear from them. And there's an important part, particularly when you're going through difficult times. I remember when Shimon Peres was Prime Minister of Israel, and they had inflation, hyperinflation, and they were developing a social pact between government, labor, and business. And that would result in a 20% decrease in the standard of living, temporarily over the course of the next 5 years. And the then Minister of Finance, at every single cabinet meeting, talked about how we have to communicate with citizens about this. And he told the story about the guy who was sentenced to die in the electric chair. And on execution day, he was locked in, but unfortunately he weighed 400 pounds, so he couldn't fit in the chair. And so the executioner said, do you mind losing 100 pounds? He said, I don't mind, but you're giving me no incentive. And so the question is, when you're going through economic times, how do you communicate with people so they know the sacrifice is something that's meaningful and there's a light at the end of the tunnel? So this notion of communication, I think, is very important. I think the issue of more people versus a recession, I think there are two things that are happening. And I think you need more people engaged in this. Autocrats are much smarter today than they used to be. They realize what happens when they begin even to lose control or even begin allowing other centers of power to develop. They're fearful of that, and they're communicating with one another. So an NGO law that appears in one country on Monday suddenly appears in another country on Friday. And for the first time that there is a network, and a growing network, of autocrats. And they use legal means and non-legal means and non-legal means to restrict independent voices, let alone opposition voices, and to try to break the link between those groups and the rest of the world. So I think we're confronted with a much more sophisticated leadership with autocratic tendencies. And second, which Sarah talked about and I alluded to, is this notion of citizens' expectations and the inability of democracies to meet citizens' expectations. It's not that people are against democracy. They are overwhelmingly for democracy, but the trust in the democratic institutions in their countries, that is where we have suffered. And that's where this notion of helping democracy deliver and getting these political institutions to deal with quality of life issues and to deal with citizens on this, I think becomes much more important, because one of two things are happening. Joseph Stiglitz talks about people going to the streets, and that's not where public policy issues should be resolved. Or people will vote for Hugo Chavez. They'll vote for the populist leader who will promise a people's democracy, and you don't need all these intermediary organizations. And Chavez himself at one point said, I'm not the cause, I'm the result. And we'll face more people like that. So I think the challenges are much greater now. And so I think it requires more engagement by more people and by more governments and by more organizations.
Bob, I thought I saw a follow-on forming. No? Okay, let's move on. Joan?
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Joan Judy Galloso. I'm at George Washington University. Come out of USAID, State Department Peace Corps. I also have to brag that some of my students are here, so I'm very proud of them for showing up. I did not tell them to come.
They expect a better grade, though.
That's over, thank goodness. Can you hear this? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
First of all, I wanted to thank you for reminding us all that this goes back to Jimmy Carter. I would just say it goes back to before Jimmy Carter, to the Title IX provision of the Foreign Assistance Act, which is kind of different. It talks about the project level. It talks about people engaging with decisions that affect them. I think every time I come to these meetings, I feel like it's important that there's a history. My question is for Sarah. It's how. Well, one of you mentioned the demand. You said we don't go to a country unless they come to us. Okay. For USAID, my question would be, what is the demand coming from the missions? That's question number one. What is it the missions are looking for? Second, sometimes when you talk about democracy and governance, it takes me back to the women in development question. Separate but equal, standalone types of activities, or integrating democracy and governance into everything we do, which, as far as I can tell, from what Malcolm is talking about, working at the grassroots, you have to have, that happens when you're integrating things, like the question that was raised here about Afghanistan and the AG program, how you get citizen participation at the grassroots. Otherwise, in their own institutions and helping them build their own institutions. And sometimes that happens in environments that are less threatening than civil society for accountability. It might happen in a credit institution, for example, or in a PTA meeting. So I just like to hear how does the headquarters policy, broader types of things connect with the programs out in the field. And my last question has to do with risk. I think there's still a DAI person in jail in Cuba. And he went there to work on democracy and governance with civil society. There's risk for host country people, and there's risk for expats. So I think we can't kid ourselves about that. Thank you.
Let's deal with that rather than add other questions at this particular point. Maybe not in all cases, but this is one that yeah.
Is this working? Yeah.
Oh, that one's working.
On the risk part, I could not agree with you more, and I think that we often forget that people are they're making choices to do this, and we need to do more on staff care. We need to do more on making sure that we can do what we can for local activists. And I don't think that we've. It's not clear to me that we've always done that, and I come into a situation where I look at what happened in Sudan, where we lost somebody not too long ago, and all your organizations have lost people, but their killer recently escaped from jail, and it's a very real thing. I mean, I'm driving to work. We're talking, my husband and I, about how is this job different? Boy, is it different from other jobs I've had. But one of the things he's, sort of almost casually said, well, of course, people's lives are at risk, and you're on the line there, and that's right. On skipping back to what are the missions looking for, just great question, obviously, from somebody who's been working in a mission. I will come back. We could go to my colleague who's in the back of the room, and he could answer the question. I think there are two things, and I'd like to report back in a year on that. We have a survey, actually, that's going to be going to the missions that looks at, is trying to get feedback from the democracy and governance officers. But I'm also planning to do a series of deep dives on democracy, human rights, and governance issues in a few select countries. I can't go everywhere, but we're beginning to prioritize where those are, and working with mission directors to design programs and really, become missions of excellence on a variety of issues that we all care about in this room. That's basically the plan. How does the policy connect with the programs?
The whole issue of standalone democracy and governance versus integrating, because you were at
Right.
a very high level of trafficking,
Right.
genocide.
What we need to do is structurally set ourselves up so that we have the policy, and in some places we don't have the policy. Frankly, at Human Rights and Development, we need to see a policy developed. There were words, I think, in the president's speech, or maybe it was the secretary's speech at Georgetown, about a rights-based approach to development. We need to unpack what that means, and then we need to incentivize people in the missions, whether that's through awards, whether that's through in the budget process, making sure that the metrics we're asking people to do are reflected so that there's an incentive to program. But I also think that for some of these issues, we need to send a message of urgency, and that may be showing up and talking about how these things are important and working with missions to develop, to implement the policy, essentially, to turn the rhetoric into action. I think that is the biggest challenge over the next 12 to 24 months. But I'm optimistic that we're not going to be able to do everything everywhere, but focus and priorities, we should be able to show some impact.
I would just say, I think you need to integrate and you need to have standalone democracy programs. I think what
Absolutely.
Yeah, you don't want is the PTA to be our only democracy strategy in a country. You can have wonderful PTAs and say, look at how successful we are, but if people are being thrown to jail, if we have elections that are stolen, and a society that is terrorized, the question is, what does this mean? And so you don't, even on women's empowerment programs, sometimes people say, well, we've got women's empowerment programs in everything we do, and you find out that it isn't anywhere. And it's one person at the end that says, well, what about women? Oh yeah, it's involved in everything we do, and then you move on to the next meeting. So I think you have to have both. And because I think a number of autocratic leaders would love just to have your PTA meetings. Get everybody out into the boondocks, forget about the Capitol, forget about the fundamental issues that people are struggling with, and get lost in the weeds somewhere. And maybe in 30, 50, 100, 200 years, when that dictator goes and the successor gets in, maybe there'll be some change. But I think you have to do it.
And Sarah was nodding, so you would say you agree.
Yeah, no, I think we're absolutely thinking about, you need to keep the core competencies, you need to have technical experts on these things. It's fundamental, and they serve 350, 400 people in missions all over the world, as well as working the interagency process. But we also, I think the real challenge, if you want to see democracy, human rights, and governance work done differently at USAID over the next 10, 15 years, the burden right now, what we're trying to figure out is how do we make sure that this is much better integrated throughout all the different kinds of initiatives in the regions, in the bureaus, so that it's not a exotic, standalone, exogenous thing, that's fundamental to the strategies and the goals that we're trying to achieve.
And I remember what you said from the podium, that there are these three major presidential initiatives, climate change, global health, and
food security.
And food security. And you volunteered a moment ago that exploring how democracy and governance is essential to those three other things is we're talking about the matrix. So, Joan, I think the integration is critical in that sense, but I also agree entirely with Ken that if you don't have some freestanding things, you're just not going to have innovation.
Right.
Shall we go on?
Hi, thanks. My name is Jenna Zhu. I'm from the Women's Foreign Policy Group, and my question is a bit of a follow-up to what you, Mr. Kramer, had mentioned as a piece of advice in your remarks about having patience. That's something that's a very un-American thing to do, and my question has to do with the American public's attitude towards international development efforts. So, in terms of our foreign policy, in terms of our foreign policy, given that I've heard a very interesting thesis that we as Americans have an extreme distaste for nation-building efforts. as soon as a war is won, and we have a great appetite for interstate wars, such as the Hussein regime, we immediately just lose our patience or lose our desire to stay after we just get rid of an autocrat. So I think, given that those are perhaps our attitudes, if that's something that you concur with, what do you think that says about, what do you think that means for you as an organization that is trying to do more of the bottom-up type of capacity building efforts that we, on a national, or just as an American people, kind of have such a distaste for when you're trying to attract more American support, particularly given our involvement in our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Why don't we go ahead and get 2 more questions? We got about 8-10 minutes left. So go right ahead.
Thank you. My name is Vivian Marley-Derrick. I'm with a new NGO, Religious Institute, which aims to strengthen African democracy. But for the purposes of this conversation, I was the Vice President for Programs at the start of NDI. And so I want to say to Warren and Kim that I commend you and celebrate you for being such good representatives of the importance of democracy for these years. And because you've been there, you really do give us an important perspective. So thank you. A comment and a question. My comment goes to the importance of the intersectoral links in terms of democracy. Sarah, you talked about how democracy helps in terms of the other 3 initiatives. It's so important, though, that we also think about education in this. President Conrad said to President Clinton when we were talking about democracy some years ago, you can't think about democracy if you can't read. And when he was head Eddie that came out of that. So it's just so important that we think about it in terms of civic education and the ways that it can help in terms that education can help in terms of civic participation, particularly. The question comes from that. I was just in Uganda for the AU meeting, and they have all these billboards up that talk about education, but also talk about the importance of the Electoral Commission in terms of civic education. My question is, what happens when the Electoral Commission is compromised, or in the IRA in this instance, and how can the programs truly strengthen that critical element of American democracy? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Dear Wilmets, my question is mostly geared at how important this commitment to democracy actually is. If you see that in this administration and as administration, countries like Pakistan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, strong violators of functioning democracy, civil society organizations are the biggest recipients of foreign aid still, and even though, as has been mentioned, Obama is trying to bring democracy into a central focal point of this foreign policy, he still does not take the step of saying we're going to scale down our support for these countries because they're not in line with what we're trying to push. Also mentioned with the Afghan elections, why you see that there was no courage of saying you're violating something that's really important and that we think is essential for the future of this country, and still continues to support and postponing taking decisive steps for the future of the development of these individual countries.
Well, who wants to tackle?
I'll go first if you want. I don't think you're ever going to see an administration where you don't have contradictions, some would say hypocrisy. And I remember literally a day after 9/11, I said to my staff, they were all wondering, how do we play in this? And I said, we're going to play in this because you really can't fix this without attention to this issue. But I said, you have to remember the number one job of the United States is not to spread democracy to other countries, it's to keep our country secure. Now, you can differ, and I did with the Bush administration on Pakistan, about how you do that. I think the mistake successive administrations make is to buy the argument of the autocrats that it's me or it's the Muslim Brotherhood. You know, it's me or it's the the Taliban that's up in the hills outside Islamabad. And time after time we seem to buy that argument. And I think one of the mistakes we always make is not getting rid of foreign aid and getting rid of those dictators and ending up with a Somoza or an Ayatollah Khomeini, or ending up, I'm sorry, with Sandinistas or an Ayatollah Khomeini, but saying how can we help build up the, something in between the autocrat and the people we would not like to see, nor would the people in the country like to see running the country. And I think that's the mistake we make time after time. It's fine to have relations with the government, whether or not you want to invite them to the Oval Office, that's another decision. It's fine to have relations with these governments if at the same time you're working for something different 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. That when the people do tire, and here I think of the work of the Asia Foundation in Indonesia. For years Suharto said it's me or some crazies out there. The Asia Foundation was building up these quote movements. In Indonesia, a lot of people poo-pooed that work and said it'll never amount to anything. Lo and behold, Suharto falls, and all of these movements become political parties. And Indonesia's sure got a lot of problems, controversy recently over Kopassus, but the bottom line is that somebody, thank God, had been working all those years on this issue, and Indonesia is doing quite well. We could do the same. Couldn't agree with them more with Vivian, where's the on the links with education. I don't think you can say a country has to be educated before it can be democratic. And here again, I think of a Mali or a Mongolia, or like I said, I was just in Somaliland. But I firmly believe that once a country's on the road, if you're not educating the kids, then 20, 30, 40 years from now, you're going to have real problems. If you do educate the kids, I think it's going to be much better. Patience on nation building, I agree. Here I often think of the example of El Salvador, which for those of you who've been in Washington 25 years or longer, know was it was the Afghanistan and Iraq of the 1980s, that and Nicaragua. Horrible, horrible place. They murdered archbishops there. We stuck by the government at the time, but then it kind of went off everybody's radar screen, except that the U.S. government over the next 20 years slowly invested fairly limited amounts of money. And we didn't have high expectations. We weren't saying, oh, do they look like us yet? Partly because I think it was kind of under the radar screen. And today, like I said, El Salvador also has a lot of problems, but they don't murder archbishops anymore. The army's gone back to the barracks. They're not out killing. You don't have death squads. You don't have guerrillas up in the hills. So I think if...
And you have the former guerrillas
exactly
in the government.
You had the former guerrillas become took the mayorship of San Salvador, and now they're the government. Imagine that. 20 years ago, that was absolutely unthinkable.
Playing by democratic rules.
Yeah, exactly. If you can do that over time, I think the trouble we have had in some of these countries is where we have gone in, not just Iraq and Afghanistan, but you have high casualties. I think that's what really bothers the American population. We didn't have, we had troops in South Korea and Germany for years. No casualties, obviously, but I think that's what really, really bothers people. I think if it's, if everybody understands that it's not prominent, then you need to have that kind of strategy of patiently investing instead of going in for 3 or 4 years saying, well, we'll spend a ton of money here, but if they don't look good after 4 years, our attention span will be over and we'll move on. Take a long-term view. I've often thought that's the problem with Haiti. Because every couple of years we invest hundreds of millions, billions in Haiti, and a year or two later we say, gee, it doesn't look any different. Well, let's wait for the next tsunami or earthquake or whatever in Haiti. It's very sad.
I was a part of a project a couple of years ago, which I think the Secretary eventually adopted, and that is smart power. The idea that we have hard power, we have the ability to persuade and engage folks, and development plays a huge role in this. I think that the American public has a lot of misperception about what we do. I think that I've yet to see a really persuasive campaign that explains to Americans what the whole democracy, human rights movement is and the role that AID plays in that. I think there are legal issues about whether and how
Yes.
AID
Can
Right,
talk
we can't
within the U.S.
advertise,
exactly.
right. So here's the issue, is that I think what we can do is we can talk much more, if we're invited to universities, we can get out and talk to people, come to a forum like this, and so that people know and have a sense of where their tax dollars are going and how they're part of a larger thing. I mean, the thing that we found in the Smart Power Commission at SID-US is that we did a listening exercise. People are really interested. People all over this country they want to be part of something larger, and they think that this is very exciting. So I think it's a really untapped resource which could actually be very helpful, because so much of what we do gets constrained or pushed or pulled by Congress. And so there's a kind of missing middle out there. You asked a question about election commissions. I've been thinking a lot about Kenya, and it's not only election commissions and the ability to make sure that those commissions are representative, but the ability to quickly resolve what happens if an election goes bad. I think that's an important piece of it. On the education piece, absolutely. There's a picture when you walk into the most gripping picture to me is of young girls in school, Muslim girls, and I asked if I could get that picture in my office because it was so motivating. I mean, it's sort of like this every day I go to work, it's her that's sort of driving this. Afghanistan, Pakistan, we're not going to resolve here, and I won't go too far into it. I'll just say that it is a really core part of the administration's approach to engage civil society, not just governments. And part of the idea is that even in places where you have repressive governments, you're not necessarily helping civil society, human rights, and democratic activists by completely shunning the government. So it's complicated, and I think that we need to do sometimes a better job of explaining the duality. And every time a senior government official goes to whatever country, they're making sure that they're meeting with genuine civil society leaders and listening and responding to them. And I think that's a critical step to it.
A couple quick points. Vivian, I agree with Sarah, the election commission is not the beginning and the end of elections, but and a good election commission doesn't guarantee a good election, but a bad election commission usually guarantees it will be a bad election. And you have from INEC in Nigeria, Professor Iwu, who is chairman, to the Kenyan experience that Sarah mentioned, goes back to 1994 and the Dominican Republic. And I think in those instances, I think we have to go in and support election commissions at some point, but if we know the election commission is going to perform poorly, both engage in malfeasance and misfeasance, sometimes we'll have to walk away from the election. The international community should be able to walk away and say, we're not going to be engaged in this process if you have an election commission that operates the way it does. And there have been occasions where we have done that. And it's a very difficult decision, but I think sometimes those hard decisions are important. With regard to democracy being high policy in the tough places like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and Egypt sometimes, the states are not going to turn themselves into human rights organizations. And to some degree, we have to recognize that at times democracy will be high policy and at times it will be lower policy. And we do have other interests we have to deal with, other short-term interests. And this is always a struggle and a fight. Now, all of us want to see those issues higher on the agenda, but sometimes we have to expect. And if I was somewhat critical of the Bush administration, I think what President Bush did is he created the impression that it was always going to be high policy. And so, therefore, when the inconsistencies between the rhetoric and the reality, it became that much more glaring. And so, but rhetoric is also important. But the question is to understand that there will be instances where other issues will trump democracy. And that's where groups like ours and other groups come into play, because I think in those places where there are other bilateral issues that are extremely important, the U.S. government ought to be investing in resources to support democracy activities on the ground. And this administration in particular talks about engagement, talks about a dual-track policy, that they want to engage in these countries, and at the same time engage with the people. And that's a very challenging mission, because you don't want the engagement part to be the most visible. How do you design and implement a second track that people will see that there is actually a second track? When I first came to Washington, I was dealing with the Jackson-Vanik legislation on immigration from the Soviet Union. Well, the Congress imposed the second track on the administration at that time, that we were going to have a second track with the Soviet Union, in addition to the engagement track that we had. And of course, Henry Kissinger adamantly opposed the second track. But it's a difficult balance in these countries. That will be a challenge for the administration. Finally, let me just say on the Iraq question, I think when both IRI and NDI went into Iraq, it was a very difficult decision. I think we went into Iraq thinking it was going to be a post-conflict situation. We went to Afghanistan thinking it was going to be a post-conflict situation. But the one thing that we said was we were not going to be a contractor for the U.S. government, and we were not going to operate solely in the green zone, because we did not want to be seen as part of the occupation of the country. Because from our perspective, the work that we do and groups like ours are going to extend, hopefully, well after the military leaves. And so I think that part of the strategy for withdrawal in these countries in terms of nation building is realizing that there are other elements of the U.S. government and elements in the non-governmental community that can continue to pursue these issues, because ultimately I believe there are other elements in places like Iraq, but I think politics are going to be very important to the future of this country. And I think that it's one of the reasons why I'm relatively optimistic about Iraq. There's probably more politics going on in Iraq today than exists in most any other country in the region. And with all the weaknesses and all the flaws and all the warts, there are some very interesting things that are going on. And successive elections have shown how the Iraqi electorate has changed in terms of what they expect and what they want.
Well, did you want to comment? We've run 10 minutes over, but I think we started 10 minutes late, so I kind of apologize for that. But I think the quality and the candor of this discussion. Did you want to add something else, Sarah?
I was just going to say, I recommend to everybody the inaugural address where the president really, I think, hits the issue of false dichotomy of our national security and human rights and democracy. And nobody says it better than he does.
Well, thank you all for your patience, and I want to give thank you very much.
Thanks, that was great. Very interesting.
You got a good discussion.